Welcome to Women Behind Bars, aka Caged Heat, our our seminar on the history of women and bartending, which is a long and illustrious one. I have with me Pamela Wiznitzer of the Dead Rabbit, one of the great up-and-coming bartenders, also a student of culinary history, and somebody who is extremely smart and not to be messed with when it comes to downing shots. So even of chilled vodka. Ouch. We will have Julie Reiner, I hope fervently, one of the great bar owners and businesswomen of our time. Obviously one of the great bartenders and mixologists, but the businesswoman aspect is also extremely strong and really, really important.
And an update, she just got off the highway. She'll be here very soon.
Oh, she'll be here. Oh, awesome. So we'll, get your knees ready. We'll be bouncing up there. I guess I should probably start at the beginning. I mean, basically the way this is going to work, I'm going to talk about some older history. Pamela's going to talk about what happened in the 20th century, and then Julie's going to talk about the challenges and some of the cool people who are women who are behind the bar now and who are running bars and bringing it into the modern age. Back in the dark backward of history, in England, all of our drink culture has largely English roots with a lot of other stuff grafted on. I mean, this is America, but the structure is pretty English, at least at the beginning. In England, in the Middle Ages, women were in charge of alcohol production largely, and also in many cases in charge of serving it as well. If you went to a great household, a place where you'd have an earl or a baron or a duke or something like that, lady so-and-so would be in charge of the kitchen. That didn't mean she was sitting there with a ladle in one hand, tasting the soup and stirring the sauce with the other. She had a large staff. She had an executive capacity. She had to run this large, complicated enterprise that was these large households. There'd be a staff of 50, and she'd be in charge. She was also in charge of making the alcohol, so she'd be in charge of brewing. That didn't mean she was the one who was boiling the grain in the pot. She was basically the brewmistress. They made a lot of beer. People did not drink water in early England. They drank beer. They drank quarts and quarts a day. You had to make a lot. And she was in charge of that. She was also, once distilling came in the 1400s, she was in charge of distilling all the family's medicinal stuff. So they'd build an extra little house under her direction, in next to one of the kitchens, and they'd put the still in there, and she'd be in charge of all the medicinal spirits and all this and that. And she was basically master distiller as well. And these were all the things that the women were supposed to be in charge of and were supposed to be good at. I mean, we're talking like the great ladies of the land. On a smaller level, the poorer people, where everybody else drank, the people who were still gentlemen and ladies who were not poor, but not necessarily had staff of dozens. If they went drinking, they would drink in a tavern, it was called, or an inn if it had hotel rooms. And the tavern or the inn, you would get wine there, but you would also get beer. And there you would have a man was the owner, usually, not always. Sometimes it would be a widow. Sometimes it was rarely a single unmarried woman. It was usually these were family businesses. Usually the daughters of the house would be behind the bar, and that's how it worked. The sons of the house would do other things, or they would run the stables. They would do that kind of stuff. The daughters would be behind the bar. They would serve out the drinks. They would talk to the customers. If you went further down the social scale, you had ale houses, which were run by an alewife, which was basically a woman, usually of a certain age, who did all the brewing and also took care of the hospitality and the serving. And all they served there was ale. The inn was a little more fancy. So you had this whole like stratified social system, but women were strongly in charge of the alcohol. Towards the 1600s, this system starts to break up as England starts to urbanize and even in a little bit industrialize. But still in an urban context, you got some quotes here. This is from one Thomas Brown, a satirical writer around 1700, and he's talking about the various establishments you would get in London. And he says, quote, "At the bar, the good man always places a charming Phyllis." Phyllis was a generic Greek name you would find in poetry for the shepherd's girl that he was hot for. And so he's being a little ironic here. This is not actually out in the countryside, and this guy is not a shepherd, nor is she like Alice with her crook, or rather Mary and her little lambs. So he always places a charming Phyllis or two who invite you by their amorous glances into their smoky territories to the loss of your sight. All right, this is a little bit weird. There's some kind of double thing going on here. We could see it's not just about the drinks. Another writer of the time, George Steele, these pretty barmaids are idols, he says. And he says, "There are in 6 or 7 places of this city, that being London, coffee houses kept by persons of that sisterhood," of the barmaids. "These idols sit and receive all day long the adoration of the youth within such and such districts." So they start to, it starts to be not really so much about the skills, but about the looks. And this starts to feature into this a lot more than in earlier times, just because now you've got an urban context and things start to get a little bit more complicated, and then you have such things as competition. And that starts to change things. Another contemporary notice is the quote, "A handsome barkeeper," handsome meaning beautiful, "invites more than the bush." The bush is like you would hang up. Oh my goodness. Ladies and gentlemen, Julie Reiner. Heroic. Anyway, just because I'm being slow as usual. A handsome barkeeper invites more than the bush. The bush is like the thing you would hang outside of an ale house saying, "We have fresh ale." She's the lodestone, the magnet that attracts men of steel, both those that wear it to some purpose and those that wear it to none. In other words, like people who run around with swords who are actual knights and people who are just pretending. Gets kind of mixed people. "No city dame is demurer than she at first greeting, nor draws in her mouth with a chaster simper. But in a little time you may be more familiar, and she'll hear a double entendre without blushing." This starts to be important. It's like, okay, these girls are flirtatious behind the bar, and that becomes like the thing that people are looking for in England behind the bar in like the 18th century. However, well, one more really pretty gross example from the poet Christopher Smart, who wrote a poem called "The Pretty Barkeeper of the Mitre Tavern," right? And the Mitre Tavern is still there in London and is still pretty good, but now it's mostly old hairy guys who look like me drinking real ale. So it's maybe a little less lively than it was. And it describes his poems. There's a table full of men in love with this pretty barkeeper. They're obsessed with her. And the way he describes her, she's all, quote, "wanton eyes and blushing cheek and heaving breasts. And while she goes about her business, basically working, she's chalking up tabs, taking orders, basically, doing everything that a bartender is supposed to do. These guys are just mooning over her. And this is one end of the historical deal with women behind bars. Is there's always this like sexualized interaction as part of it. However, not everybody played that game. James Ashley, the guy who owned the biggest and most revolutionary punch house in London, the guy who made like basically invented modern bartending by doing drinks a la minute, punch in all sizes down to the glass at the bar. His bartenders were all women. His lead bartender, Mrs. Gaywood, I don't know her first name. It's very hard to dig into some of this stuff. But she was important enough that when he got his portrait painted and his son's portrait painted, he also got her portrait painted. You know, and they were all hanging up behind the bar. She was basically important enough to be almost a partner in the business. She ran the place. She clearly was senior and strong at what she did. So you've got like some of this going on. Again, in England, this tradition of women behind the bar goes up into the 19th century, where it's all barmaids, and the barmaids are struggling to deal with these new American-style drinks that come over. But they're basically behind the bar. They're supposed to look good. They're also supposed to be competent and serve beer and spirits and et cetera, et cetera. In Germany, the tradition is the same. Bartending is a women's job. As my friend Hendrik here just reminded me, in Denmark it was the same. It was always women behind the bar, even in the cocktail bars later on. Something weird happens in America that after the Revolution, before the Revolution, you would see a lot of barmaids. You start seeing fewer and fewer, and it starts disappearing. And this is very strange. At the same time, bartending starts to become this technical / scientific job when you're dealing with ice and complex formulae for mixing drinks, et cetera, et cetera. And there are two ways of looking at this. You could say that it became more complicated and the men were more interested in complication and took over the job. But, you know, complication raises status of things. And you could also say that the men made the job more complicated so they could kick the women out. The same thing had happened with brewing and distilling in America. Brewing and distilling in the 1600s, early 1700s were still done basically as in England, mostly women's work. A lot of women made ale for the household. You didn't go out and buy it, you made it. America got a little more complicated. It started to favor larger scale breweries because a lot of places you couldn't brew because of the hot climate and stuff like that. And brewing started to become more scientific. And as it got more scientific, it got taken further and further out of women's hands until by the end of the 18th century, brewing was suddenly this male-like scientific thing. However, the men didn't really understand what they were doing. The women had been making better beer, by all accounts, because they had a lot of tradition on their hand. The men were trying to make this more complicated, scientific, and modern, and as such, they were fucking up the fermentation. Which is a traditional, like, very, kind of low to the ground sort of thing that you really need to know how to do and does not respond well to half-assed science. So anyway, in America, it starts with brewing and distilling and ends up behind the bar, and by the 1800, 1810, 1820, it's mostly men behind the bar. However, it's not entirely monolithic. You've got these famous bartenders, like I'll use New York as an example because I know it best. You've got Orsemus Willard at the City Hotel, the guy who made the mint julep a bar drink, the iced mint julep in like 1817 and revolutionized American drinking. You've got Cato Alexander, a freed slave up north of New York City now at what amounts to like 52nd, 55th Street, something like that, in Manhattan. That was 3 miles outside of town back then. And he's also making like gin cocktails and all this stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And this is in the 1810s, 1820s. 1830s, you start to see this revolution in America with fancier and fancier drinks. Suddenly the drinks are getting their own crazy names. You've got Flash of Lightning, you've got Brandy Smash, you've got all these made-up names, Vito, Split Ticket, Tip and Tie. Like basically they're making up names for drinks and making up new drinks like we do today. And these so-called fancy drinks are kind of new and revolutionary. They're not traditional, and you have to know how to make them. One of the best places in the 1840s to get them in New York is at this place called Niblo's Garden. This guy, William Niblo, was an English immigrant who set up, they used to have pleasure gardens in New York. This is before we had Central Park. you'd take a half city block and fence it off and put shrubbery in there and some paths through it. You'd have a bandstand in the back and a counter where you could get some food and a bar on this side, and people could, and plenty of seating, and it was a really nice, pleasant outdoor space to go. Now, William Niblo built his garden north of the city at what is today Broadway and Prince Street, really, like the middle of like Soho. At the time, it was north of the city. You had to get a shuttle bus to go up there, horse-drawn, but nonetheless. However, behind the bar was Mrs. Niblo, Martha King Niblo, his wife, who, quote, one of the people who had her drinks said, she mixed all the drinks and knew how. And he went on to say, this was John Broome, a famous English actor. A sherry cobbler from her dainty hand was something specially inviting and created an involuntary relish for that seductive and not altogether innocent beverage. So she was like making like drinks like high tech, the latest in drinks, same as you would get at any of the top bars, and then and more besides. Another observer at the time said, at one end of Niblo's garden was a large bar, and Mrs. Niblo served the American drinks. Many of the fanciful admixtures, that is to say, drinks, which have since become notorious, were first passed over the bar at Niblo's garden. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is something I really am dying to research more, because 1840s, this is when, when she was behind the bar. She died in 1851. So that decade was when American drinking really changed from the old, decisively from the old kind of colonial or post-colonial period to the Jerry Thomas era. And this was like really important. This was like all the modern drinks came in and all the modern techniques of making drinks with ice. And it seems clearly that, she was at the forefront of it. And not only that, she was the one who made, Niblo was a rich man. Unfortunately, she died young, or not that young. I mean, she died at age 49 in 1851. He lived for another 20 years, a very rich man, and he always gave credit to her because not only could she mix drinks, as he said, she was a born bookkeeper, and she knew how to run a business in a way that he didn't. He was a great host. She was, however, like the real fries behind the operation there. She was the one who kept things going. So there were examples like this. And Niblo's was not a dive. This is like the fanciest people in New York went to this place. Everybody went to this place. It was famous. It was the place where visiting celebrities went. It was like the top of the top in New York. At the same time, there were other places in New York you could find women mixing drinks. Like if you went to Prince Street in Soho, there were all these little row houses back then, and every single one of them off of Broadway was a whorehouse. And in those places, you would find women mixing drinks as well, along with doing other tasks in the entertainment business. But and this was, this was the other side of this. It was not respectable to be behind the bar. It was, you always ran that association of being this sexualized job for women that in England they certainly flirted with very heavily and used that as part of the job. But at the same time, you got a certain freedom from that to deal with the customers in a way that they would not take from men. If they were acting up, you could squish them down. You could flirt with them. You could also speak to them in a way that they would start fisticuffs if a man tried. So there was a little freedom with that. At the same time, there was also this sort of idea that this is not a respectable profession. And yet, people like Mrs. Niblo showed that it could be respectable if you made it that way. If you had the money to do it, if you had the backup, if you had the opportunity. Let's jump to San Francisco for a minute. Let's see how we're doing on time also. Oh yeah, I gotta pick up the pace here a little bit. We jumped to San Francisco. San Francisco was founded from nothing in 1849, basically. There was a little tiny town on the bay there, and then the gold rush comes, and things were nuts. There were many female bartenders in town, 1849, the Times-Picayune letter from San Francisco. They sent a reporter from here to there to see what the hell was going on. It's like, wait, there's a town sportier than New Orleans? We better check it out. We might learn something here. We got to at least look at the competition. And this guy's talking about gambling establishments, and there's like the Chilean woman running the gambling tables at one place, and there's stuff like that. And then he says, there are more new gambling establishments than there are catfish in the Mississippi, and all have their peculiar attractions or baits. In one, there are 3 comely-looking American girls who tend bar and are deep in the mystery of making rum punches, brandy smashers, and gin cocktails. So these women aren't just there to look good. They know how to mix the drinks, and they're mixing the drinks. And this is important because this becomes a big issue. Speaking of the drinks, we started when we came in, we had a hanky-panky, and I'd like to thank our sponsor, Beefeater Gin and English Gins, Beefeater in Plymouth, for these drinks. Thank you so much. We have the hanky-panky invented by Ada Coleman, Ada Coley-Coleman, head bartender at the Savoy Hotel until she was kicked out so they could put a man behind the bar in 1926. But that's sort of a sore spot. This second drink is by this crazy French journalist, Tatiana, who traveled around the world having adventures, basically, and in the 20s and 30s, and really had a hell of a life. And she contributed this drink, the coup de cafard, or the kind of crazy idea, to a Parisian drink book in 1929. There were a lot of women contributing drinks to that. There were only a few gin ones, and this is the best gin one. So we'll toast to Tatiana. She was one of those people who went around with one name and could get away with it. Oh, that's strong. That is not a weak drink, is it? Okay, so San Francisco, you had this tradition, even like after the gold rush. In 1872, another little newspaper article, there was a hotel in San Francisco under the same management of the fair sex. From the proprietress to the hall girl, from the bartender, under the sole management, of the fair sex. Typo there. My fault. From the proprietress to the hall girl, from the bartender to the boot black, all connected with the establishment are women. The porters were these big, beefy German girls who could carry the Saratoga trunks on their shoulders. The bartender, the article says, can make a cocktail quicker and better than any other in the state, and drinks herself anytime she is asked to, which on average is 50 times a day. Now, that might be a slight exaggeration, but that was, as a bartender, you were expected to take a drink if the customer asked you, but you would always have like one little sip, and they would have a big drink. So she was maybe, she was doing fine, but she was clearly hanging, like walking the walk and talking the talk. I mean, and a really serious bartender. I wish they'd given her name. This is what you run into. At this point, bartenders like that are a novelty. Later, 10 years later in San Francisco, 15 years later, the Chronicle finds many female bartenders in town. Usually their route is through the family business, as it was in England, except in San Francisco, they're not just serving ale, they're mixing drinks, etc. And they go to this one place on 4th Street, one of the largest drinking establishments in town, right in the heart of San Francisco. And the guy says, a pretty slender girl with blue eyes and fair ruffled hair may be seen behind the bar. She's competent in all the basics of mixing drinks. She has, quote, a condescending smile for all the respectable patrons, and, quote, a mixed air of superiority and indifference for the ordinary drunks and loudly dressed dudes. Now, I myself have seen that same air from many women bartenders I know for the drunks and the loudly dressed dudes. So I think that is she probably knew the job pretty well. I mean, that sounds about right, I have to say. You smile at the good customers and the rest. They interviewed the owner about having like a woman behind the bar, and he says, well, okay, there's no ruffianism, no loud swearing or vulgar language when she's there. No fights or glass breaking are ever seen or heard in my place nowadays. And I attribute the peaceful and church-like state of things to the presence of my lady bartender. I think he's probably laying on a bit thick. Well, at the same time, I never did a better business. And then he goes, of course there are girls and girls. I couldn't expect such a satisfactory condition of affairs with a lot of coarse-featured and brazen-faced women, such as you see in some of the Kearney Street dives. Those are basically the whorehouses and the drunk bars. So there's clearly a lot of women bartending. But this is kind of interesting because that church-like atmosphere became something that was more and more desirable as the 19th century wore on, at least for many bar patrons, at least in the fine bars and in the cocktail bars and the hotel bars. That early on America, like spitting tobacco juice, I've got my feet up on the fender by the fire, and I'm spitting tobacco juice and drinking cocktails and swearing, and I'm as good a man as anybody in this place, so fuck yous all. I mean, that was the old kind of America, and that was dying out at this point. And there were plenty of men's bars that were striving for that, with men behind the bar, where they were striving for that same attitude. And that started to be more and more of a trend, and you start seeing this, almost a feminization by these standards of American bars in the late 19th century, when this rough and ready rowdiness starts to be a bit much. And you can kind of understand that. In New York, being New York, they cut to the chase. They say, okay, why are we screwing around? Let's just get a bunch of British barmaids over. We've got money, we'll hire people. We're not going to train up our daughters to do this or anything. We'll hire a bunch of British girls. They know how to do this really well. 1884, there's an article in the New York Sun, one of the bars on Broadway in the theater district then, which was up in the 20s, gets 4 British barmaids to come over and puts them behind the bar. And unfortunately, they don't know how to mix the drinks. And everybody's like, oh my God, I asked for a whiskey and sherry. And she asked me if I wanted those together. Who would mix those? She doesn't know anything. So this experiment didn't work because the drinks are hard to mix, supposedly. In 1891, one of the great bartenders in American history, and this does not show him in a good light, William Schmidt, a German, is tending bar at this guy Major Hayward's place on Lower Broadway, and his boss decides to get barmaids in. He thinks it's going to be good for business. We're going to get this church-like atmosphere, and we're going to get the customers coming in, and it'll be lovely. William, will you train them? William says to one of his journalist friends, supposing one of my friends should come in and ask for a widow's kiss after his dinner, would he get it from an English barmaid? I think not. London is a great town, but when it comes to drinks, it is slow, very. English barmaids can draw ale, but do you think that all of them put together could mix a La Première that would be fit to drink? And how about a life prolonger? Anticipation, sweet recollections, brain dusters, and canary birds. Could they mix them? And he goes on, he goes on at great length about the fine art of mixing drinks, and women don't know anything about this. They can't handle this. It's outside of, women's earthly ken. I mean, clearly other people have demonstrated, going back to the early days, that it's not that hard. And he goes on and he predicts the barmaid will be a failure and bitches and moans and quits his job. And not only that, just to make things worse, he goes to the Women's Christian Temperance Union and gets them to sponsor a bill banning women from mixing drinks in New York bars. And this bill evidently passes. Of course it does. Because he's William, like the bartender, and he's the most famous bartender of his day, like utterly beyond famous. Everybody in America is proverbial, like the only William he's known. And he really is a cool and interesting guy. However, attitudes, he needs some enlightenment. He was definitely a confirmed bachelor who died very young from some obscure disease that drove him insane. I'm not going to get into more about that. So these girls come behind the bar, and there's no William. And the patrons flock in, and Hayward, his boss, is making more money than ever. A few weeks later, the New York Sun sends a reporter in to talk to one of them. And she says, American drinks? Oh, we found them no trouble. We had a bartender stay with us for a week and show us everything. American drinks are very easy to make, really. As for cocktails, and those we find are the most common drink by far, we learned to make them in no time. We've also learned all about fizzes and, in fact, everything that has ever been called for. The only drink that we've really found troublesome is the Pousse Café. We haven't got that one down really fine yet, but we're making a special study of it. I mean, I haven't got that one down really fine yet either, I mean, frankly. But, you know, William was one of those guys who had all these finicky, complicated homemade drinks, like complicated formulas, etc. And that was his shtick. And these girls were fucking with his hustle, you know. And boy, did they ever, because they did just fine for a little while. However, what happens? Other bars are getting the women in, the barmaids in, and the customers will not leave them alone. They're pestering them, they're hitting on them, they're speaking coarsely to them. And it's just annoying. The men do not know how to behave when there's a woman behind the bar. They see the girl behind the bar, they think whore, you know, because that's the culture they've seen. They haven't had the good examples like Mrs. Niblo have long been gone. And now it's all been like just the coarse women, and it's a real issue. And the women are just fine behind the bar. The men are impossible with the women behind the bar. And finally, the women have to. Most of them just can't hack it. You know, it's like, this is just too much. These guys are pigs, every one of them, and they will not stop being pigs. The men do not know how to behave in a civilized way. So this is the 1890s, right? Things start changing in the 1900s. I'm almost done here. Transition time. I know I've gone over. Things start changing slowly. For one thing, women start mixing cocktails at home. It becomes part of society. It's like the cocktail is, it used to be vulgar. It was the kind of thing, you know, a sort of a coarse behaviored man, the kind who would go up to a charming young lady behind the bar and say something gross to her. It would be the kind of thing that man might drink, you know, and that changes in the 1890s, 1880s. It starts changing. It starts to become acceptable for even, you know, a respectable man to drink cocktails, and respectable women too. You start seeing ladies' bars popping up where women can go in and sit and drink cocktails, sometimes with male bartenders, sometimes with women bartenders. You start to see women mixing drinks at home. You start to see the cocktail escaping this like male sporting life context that it had been imprisoned in for most of the 19th century. With the great exceptions like Niblo's and some of those places in San Francisco. And it starts to break out of that. It starts to get a little more universal. You start seeing bold young ladies drinking Manhattan cocktails at bars. Why? Because they can. And why shouldn't they? And what the hell is wrong with you for telling me I can't? Who are you to tell me I can't? And the bars start changing. You start having bars that cater to a clientele that's male and female. Before that, the neighborhood saloon would have a back room where women could go drink if they sat at a table. They couldn't come up to the bar. The bar was for men. But now it's like these new places at the great hotels, and like at the Hoffman House, and the greatest hotel bar in New York and in America and in the world, pretty much probably the greatest bar in the world at the time. They got rid mostly of their stand-up bar in 1906 and replaced it with cafe tables where men and women could drink together. And suddenly, you know, this starts changing, and you start seeing more and more female drinkers, female bartenders, and that starts to slide us into Prohibition, where the rising thing is this, the sexes drinking together, and some of the prohibitions on who gets to be behind the bar are starting to break down. I mean, they took a long time to die, but you start seeing seeds planted in the first decades of the 20th century. In 1895, even as early as that, according to the Syracuse Standard, there were 147 female bartenders in the United States. How they got that figure, I don't know. It was probably rather low. It must have been from the census, from the United States Census. But you start seeing more and more as things go on. But I'm going to pass it over to Pamela now to take us through the 20th century and some of the weird shit that happened then, if you don't mind.
It wasn't that easy.
Do you want to stand up here?
Yeah,
or?
sure, I'll go over there. How's everyone doing? There we go. No, that sucked. Okay, how's everyone doing? Good, all right. First off, I just want to say it's a really big honor to speak in front of so many women in the room who are great colleagues, very influential to me. So this is a dream come true. Familiar faces
It's an
out
honor
there.
for me too. So.
And in front of Wondrich. So I have to say, times were not easy between the 1900s to the 1980s. We spent a lot of tax dollars keeping women from bars. So I'm really glad we did that with our money back then. You know, it's everything. But it's really important to set the tone right now. When we're talking about women during this time, we're going to be talking about America. We could go to other continents as well, but right now we're going to be predominantly talking about America. As well, there's a really big discrepancy between socioeconomic classes. Class plays a huge factor in terms like who's going to bars, who's working in bars. As well, we have to know that sexuality is going to be an overbearing theme in the 1900s. Starting with the whole idea that, just a very quick context is that I study alcohol in terms of my master's degree at NYU. So I did a big study on whiskey and women, which is how I sort of got linked up to Wondrich over here. And it's always been a fascinating topic. I went to a women's college, so maybe I'm just really fueled with all this angst in me. But I've always been just so fascinated by, and Julie and I talk about this, why there are not so many women. And when you start learning in the 1900s about the struggles and the trials and tribulations, you understand that where it all started was that in the early 1900s, we're talking 1900 to 1910, women in bars were prostitutes most of the time. The women that were found there were there to sell themselves, and they were brought on board by people to also upsell whiskey. Whiskey was really hot at the time, and they wanted to sell a lot of it in bars. So they told women, sell it. You can make somewhere between $15 to $25 a shift doing it. One woman made $50,000 in a year. I don't know if you know what that sort of transfers to in this day and age, but let's just say when Jerry Thomas was making $100 a week back in the 1800s, he was making more than the vice president. So you can bear in mind how much that is, and it was a little bit controversial. But you couldn't really have an establishment unless you had some women there who were selling whiskey. So first off, women were associated as a commodity. So they couldn't really sell anything because they themselves were being sold. But then sort of things changed a teeny bit when World War I broke out, because a lot of men were going to war. So in smaller communities and smaller towns, they needed women to take care of the jobs that the men could not do. Women started to go behind bars. As well, there was a huge rise in immigration. And during that time, other cultures and norms sort of infiltrated society. So a really great example is that the Irish female immigrants of the 1910s, they drank far more than the American women. Shocker. They also set up shops called shebeens. They were sort of home kitchen liquor stores that out of their own homes, where they would sell a lot of product. They made a lot of their own moonshine, their own spirits, and they would sell it there, which bars and taverns got really mad because they saw it as a form of competition. So there was a lot of incentives to put the kibosh on that. So already we're seeing in these small towns like the 1900s that women were trying to hold their own in terms of the alcohol hold in the city, but they were really being tackled by society. But the real change actually happened during Prohibition. Prohibition obviously was our favorite time in all of alcohol history. And it was interesting because in 1922, more women were being brought to court as bootleggers than ever before. They said that there are about 100 women in 1922 that were on trial in DC, Philadelphia, and New York City. And they're finding more women sometimes than men, because they were able to put the flask in their blouse, put the flask up their skirt, because the men couldn't touch them. The police couldn't go near them and touch them or frisk them. So we always had an upper edge.
They tried.
You know, they always did try. But it was a really big issue back during Prohibition because women, well, I don't think it's an issue, but it really was very controversial because women were seen as the people bringing alcohol in and out. And they said that in a press conference in 1924, it was reported that drinking was significantly up amongst women. So, you know, the upper echelons of society are getting pretty upset about this. They're like, we are so dignified, we don't drink. It must be the other women. So, basically, contrary to the popular belief, as we all know, the 18th Amendment, people thought that, oh yeah, women totally upheld this. We had the organization of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. But in actuality, there were more women who were against that amendment than were for it. There were some really early groups that were formed. Some of the earliest combatants were the Molly Pitcher Club, and for those who don't know, the Molly Pitchers Club was founded in 1922, a very short-lived group. And they operated under the name the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment. And they basically set out to call out people on habits that weren't really in line, they were more criminal than those of drinking alcohol. Their philosophy and their pledge was to procure the sale of light wines and beers regulated by several states and the stronger spirits to be regulated by the government. They tried really hard, and yet they broke up in 1924. Like most boy bands only have that time frame also. But the real hero of the time of Prohibition, and someone who's my inspiration, and if you don't know her, is a woman named Pauline Sabin. Now, Pauline Sabin, the famous story of her goes is that she was sitting at one of the WCTU meetings with Ella Bull, who gets out front, and Ella Bull says, "I speak for the women of America." And she was just looking around, she goes, stood up, she goes, "Well, you don't speak for me." And she sort of walked on out. And she realized that Prohibition was really terrible for her two sons. It was terrible for her husband because everyone would be sneaking outside and drinking. And she says, "I can't raise a good family this way. We have to repeal this amendment." So she formed one, I think, the most interesting organization during the time, the WONPR, which stands for the Women's Organization of National Prohibition Reform. And people think that the WCTU was very popular. I think when we all had like our history textbooks back in the day, we always hear about that group, but not the WONPR, right? Right? Who's listening to me still? Yeah, there we go. But what's interesting is that they didn't really have about 500,000 people in the WCTU. There was 1.1 million in the WONPR. They were strong women, my kind of women. And her work, Pauline Sabin, was so influential. I mean, she was from a very well-to-do family. She had a lot of political connections. Her husband, Charles Sabin, was very well known. She was able to really infiltrate some change. They are some of the factors as to why the amendment was repealed. But what's interesting is that she was so influential that she was on the cover of Time magazine in the 1930s, and the woman who was sort of on there before was in 1923, a woman made the cover. So to have her face in there as like one of the faces of Prohibition reform was really quite starking and striking. But it was really a very interesting time because women became politically inclined towards bars. It was the first time you see women really taking hold, not on behind the bars, but in front of the bars to try to change and reform everything. But it's really interesting because a lot of other acts came way. And in 1878, there was something called the Barmaid Act. And that turned into a law in 1939 in Pennsylvania, outlawing women behind bars. So already we're seeing now is that, all right, so Prohibition, you know, we're over with that, but we still don't want the women behind bars. They say that in the post-prostitution days, whiskey slinger days, most bars in the 1950s also banned women from serving drinks. And there's a very interesting book that was found during the time of Prohibition of this woman named Mary Louise Cecilia from Texas, who operated by the name of Queen of the Night, and she was really known to entice men to come to her bar with dancing. So it was still thought and it was still known that that's the role of women in bars, and they didn't want that. You know, it was a time of change, but they were really against that whole idea and notion. In 1938, a law in Kentucky said that women could only be served at tables. So if they were going to be allowed in bars, as Wondrich told us, there were back entryways, and they were now letting women into bars and taverns, they still couldn't approach the bar. That wasn't proper. And again, we're talking about class definitions here. And they also prohibit any female as a barmaid. The only duties that a female could have would be as a waitress, a cashier, or as an usher. So already second-class citizens within the frame of a bar or a tavern. And then unions started popping up. So men were like, we need to make unions. This is the only way we're going to be official, and we can have a boys' club, and we're going to keep the women out. It's like boys in first grade do that too, but. And in the 1930s in San Francisco, it said union men do not patronize taverns that have women behind bars. These places are unfair to organized labor. Demand the union button from the bartender who serves you, meaning look for the man with a button, and that's who you want a cocktail from, because that was the only way you get a really good drink and someone you should support. And then the Troy Record in New York, they basically were for and applaud the efforts of the ban of women. And they said, who wants the hand that rocks the cradle mixed in whiskey sours? I do. I personally do. So as you can,
as long as it's a good whiskey sour.
I know. It'd probably be better, right?
Who cares?
It'll be great whiskey sour with egg white. So, but a lot of it changes in World War II. Men go off to war again. And alongside you're seeing, the ban was sort of more targeting women because they didn't want women going in solo into bars thinking that they were going to entice soldiers and steal their wallets. They also didn't want women going in there unless they were had another man with them or were on a date. It could be seen as inappropriate or that you had other motives. But during this time, there was a really strong figure. Rosie the Riveter was a really strong presence, and along that came the concept of Bessie the bartender. In a lot of small towns, again, women took over as the role of the bartender. But in the larger cities like New York, our fabulous city, there were people like Jack Townsend of the AFL Bartenders Union. And he basically publicly announced that they did not want women at all anywhere near their bars. He said that we'll fight to the last ditch to keep them out. Because in his mind, they had enough people there. They had enough bartenders. They didn't need the women to take over the duties. And it got so extreme during the 1940s that one of the most controversial cases that went as far as the Supreme Court was one in 1948 called Gozart versus Cleary, and upheld a Michigan law that said that only females that are associated with the owners of the bar, so the wife and the daughters or family members, could be barmaids. Otherwise, no women are allowed to tend bar at all or be hired as bartenders in Michigan. It was overturned in 1955, but at that time, it sort of set a precedent throughout the states, and so this idea that women, it's illegal. It's just totally illegal to have women behind bars, which would cause a huge climb and a huge reach for women to try to combat that. It wasn't really until, and women in Sacramento in 1953 was said that in a case they were arrested for posing as bartenders. They were trying to protest, they were just trying to pose as them behind a bar, and then they got arrested, just trying to make it. That was a really good idea, guys.
I have to say, I've seen a few women in Sacramento posing in bartenders to this day. But a few men as well, so.
So needless to say, that wasn't a really good effort on their end, but they tried. It was worth the effort. So the Women's Association of Allied Beverage Industries, which formed in 1944, they tried to fight the measures, and they were only 7,500 women strong. Yet they tried. They had walks and everything, but it wasn't enough to really combat what was happening in the United States. It wasn't really. The 1960s was also pretty terrible for women. It wasn't getting much better. In 1964, 26 states prohibited women from behind the bar. And interesting then, Georgia didn't allow mixed drinks until 1964, so clearly most states had wrong priorities at the same time. And also in Wisconsin, it was said that there was a bar called the Outgamey County Tavern that banned women from bartending because it was chivalry towards women. So they thought they were doing some good. They thought they were doing lots of good at the time. And Pennsylvania, as we do know, had the Barmaids Act starting in 1939, and it went through the 60s. And there was a woman named Kate Deinberg, and she was arrested for violating it when she poured beers behind the bar because they were short-staffed. They couldn't find any other males to be behind the bar. So she got behind there and says, you know what, roll up the sleeves, I'm just gonna serve the beers, and she was immediately arrested. So that's what happens when you try to own and operate a place. You still couldn't even do it. And it was her family's bar, and they wouldn't let her. So we like to call the 1970s a time of liberation. This is when everything sort of changed. for the good, I would like to say. It was 1971, and California was still barring women from being behind a bar and from pouring whiskey, they officially said. And luckily, you know what? I'm a big fan of going to bars of all shapes and sizes. I'm not just a cocktail bartender, okay? I like dive bars, I like my strip clubs and everything. And if it weren't for a topless bar called the Sailor Inn, they wanted to move their dancers behind the bar's bartenders. And all of a sudden the court's like, sure, that sounds great. And they overturned that entire rule. So thanks, topless bars. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be behind the bar anymore. The power of the chest. So it was and then, as we all know, in 1972, there was a really big act across the country for the Equal Rights Amendment. Unfortunately, it was never passed, but there was a lot of talk, and a lot of women rallied behind this as an opportunity to use this as leverage and a platform to get behind the bar. It was supposed to it's supposed to eliminate the ban on women and behind bars. And in 1977, even though it wasn't officially an amendment and it was just an act, 77% of all states ratified that amendment. So there were only a few still holding on to it. And it was pretty great because in DC there were women that were marching the streets, a group called the Concerned Women for America. But then unfortunately, as many things went down the tube in the 80s and 82, the act never passed. It was interesting for some women who were known in the industry. There was a very famous woman named Joy Perrin. She attended bars in the 1960s, and then she moved to Louisville in 1978 when sort of a lot of the laws started getting lifted. And she was known as the bad girl of bourbon, and she wanted to bartend for forever. And she's one of those people that she pushed past it, and she said, I'm just going to keep bartending. Especially when the 70s and 80s came around, she said, I definitely could. She could move from one part of the country to another. And the band still existed in lots of other cities. And I live in New York, and the most famous bar is McSorley's. And it's a little bit hard as a female to go in there because we're talking about the place that wouldn't allow women in there until 1970. And one of the last bars to ban women anywhere, even just from drinking in there. So it's one of the things, you pick up the beer and you're like, I don't want to support this, but they're letting me in here now.
Celebrate your freedom.
I celebrate it.
They're still not very friendly in there.
Yeah.
Not friendly to anybody in there.
Pouring beer all day and lots of tourists would make you very unfriendly. But
I tried to give the guy a credit card in a rare lapse of sanity. I've been drinking there since 1978, and he just looked at me and he goes, "You know better than that. What's wrong with you?"
But
So, they don't have to be nice.
no,
It's McSorley.
you can build an entire reputation on being grumpy.
Yeah. So don't take it. I don't think that's gender related at this point.
It's not so much though. But as you can see, a big issue that you see overarching here is that a lot of people were just scared about women behind bars because of the sexual connotations associated with them earlier on. Their place in the bar, what they were at before, and then also trying to get a hold of the man's domain, the man's tavern, keeping that in place. And Wondrich and I were talking about earlier. If you read a lot of cookbooks also from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, especially about food in America and cookbooks that are just for women in the kitchen, there's also areas in the back that talk about cocktails to prepare at home, drinks to prepare at home for when your husband comes home from work. And another big emphasis of the time was for women to be prepared at home to mix a martini or to fix a drink for your husband. Mm-hmm. So in actuality, thanks for banning us from bars because we were just preparing for the revolution ahead. But thank goodness a lot of things changed in the 1980s, and Julie's going to come into this about how women started approaching the bars again. And if it weren't for the fabulous chain of the Holiday Inn hotels that started saying, they're like, wait, we put a female behind the bar. Oh my gosh, there's so many people at the bar to hang out with her. Let's do this everywhere. And they started putting females behind all the bars.
Let's get the barmaids in.
Yeah. And that was it. And it was just all of a sudden this huge change that happened because the Holiday Inn gave a chance. And interesting, if any of you see Tony Abou-Ghanim, he has a great story. I was talking to him last night that his aunt, she passed away a few years ago, she opened a bar and worked there for 71 years in Michigan.
Yeah.
And I talked to him, I was like, well, this had to be before the court case in 1948. He goes, what court case? But it was really amazing talking to him because he said, she wanted to open a place that she opened in the 1930s, and she just stayed there and she operated it, and she operated with her family. And there were women behind bars doing things. I mean, heck, my grandma was making blueberry liquor and selling it to her friends. And so You know,
I mean, there were always
always women.
there were always people who really didn't pay attention to these laws, and there were always plenty of parts of the country where nobody would turn you in.
Yeah.
I mean, that census stuff. I was looking through the 1940 census, and I put in the name Mary and bartender, and that's all I searched, and I came up with like something like 190 Marys who listed their profession as bartender, 160 Annas. I'm just picking up, stereotypical like women's names and put them in there to see, and they were all, not all, mostly Eastern European, mostly in a belt from like Rochester down to Pittsburgh, through Ohio and up into Michigan and Chicago, and there were always, it's a big country, it's always a complicated country, and that's what's so cool about it, is there are parts where this is like the culture, there are parts where like, nah, we're fine with women behind the bar. That's not really our issue here. We're not threatened by that. These are our homes. It's like the old ale house thing. These are mostly like neighborhood bars in places like Milwaukee, where neighborhood bar is a neighborhood bar. Women behind the bar is fine. That's not really a threat. It's like the big fancy gigs in New York or in San Francisco that where women were a real threat, because that was also an economic issue. It's like, wait, I've got competition now suddenly from women who make drinks just as well as I do and have boobs. This is going to be a problem with my clientele. So you can see some of these bartenders really being a little bit churlish about it. Anyway, sorry to...
No, it's fascinating. No, yeah, so that's basically the interesting part about this moment in history, is that it's all politically driven. And I think that's what's so amazing in the 1900s, is that we spent so much time enacting laws, we spent so much time repealing laws, we spent so much time with being so active and voicing our opinions, that's how women got in there. It wasn't even us being behind a bar or necessarily always in front of one. It's just everything that happens sometimes on the outside of the bar. So for me, I find this period being so interesting leading up to what we're going to say the modern times. And also because the dynamics of America has changed so drastically much with the women working in the workforce. So without further ado, I think it's time to hear about some kick-ass women who are leading the pack and leading the way from one of the most killer women in the industry, Julie.
Hi, everybody. I made it. I can't believe it. I'm actually here.
I know. $1,300 later.
$1,300. What? Who cares? Yeah.
Sure.
So what? Who cares?
Priceless.
I was going to give these women their due. So I'm here to really talk about what's happening today from the 90s forward and the women that are kind of leading the pack of the modern cocktail revolution. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about my personal experience. I've been in the bar business for 25 years. I'm only 29, but, I started really young.
Early training helps.
And, in the beginning, I was cocktail waitressing in Waikiki, and it was all men behind the bar, and I was a waitress, and I would always look back there and go, ooh, I wonder what's happening back there. And it was absolutely no ladies behind the bar. You had to call things in a specific order, and if you called it out of order, they just stand there and stare at you until you fixed your order of drinks. And then, I went to college, and suddenly I was in Florida, and I was able to get behind the bar. It was the whole, oh yeah, let's put the boobs behind the bar. I have a picture that I was looking for this because it's so funny, of me in college with two other girls behind the bar with a knot in our shirt. So I'm in college and I've got my knot tied behind my bar. I'm making a fortune behind the bar, and all of the people in my dorm are coming in and getting drunk, and I'm going home and doing the money dance and just laughing at them while they pull each other up and down the hallway naked on mattresses. True story.
Well, come on, that's higher education.
I thought, there's something to this bar business. So, time goes on, and, for me, the number one question that I get from writers and journalists is, what does it feel like to be a lady in the bar business? And it's kind of funny because my entire existence behind any bar has been very much all with women. I learned to bartend really at a bar called the Red Room in San Francisco that was all women behind the bar. It was run by women, and it was really inspiring. I remember sitting down at that bar, and I was like, I can so do this. I'm going to open my own bar one day. And that bar really kind of sparked it in me because I saw these women making cocktails, and at that time, San Francisco was very far ahead of New York when it came to like fresh juice and all of that. So I moved to New York, and everywhere I went, they were like, oh, are you sure you don't want a cocktail waitress? And I was looking, I'm like, I can bartend circles around these guys. And I finally get a job managing a bar in the West Village that was owned by Judy Paul, a woman. So I worked for her for a long time. It's her bar. And I start talking about opening my own place. So I opened Flatiron Lounge with 3 other women, Michelle Connolly, Susan Fedroff, and Christina Cossi. And Michelle had grown up in her mom's bar. Her mom owned Franny's Oyster Bar in the West Village. And so she was totally a bar rat of New York City. And so, you know, I don't really know anything else. I left from there. I opened Clover Club with Susan Fedroff and Christine Williams. And my entire existence behind bars has been with women. So I get the question that, you know, why is it that they're asking me this? Traditionally, women weren't behind the bar so much, and it is a man's sort of profession in the past, but it's not where we're at, not where I'm at today, and I never really cared so much. So I go from there. I open the Pegu Club also with Audrey Saunders. You get it. It's me and a whole bunch of ladies opening bars. So that's been my experience. I wanted to tell a little story. Recently, I was asked to be on a panel with David Wondrich and Dale DeGroff and Sasha Petrosky, and it was the who's who of the bar business, and it was Charles Schumann. For those of you who don't know who he is, he's a German bartender. He's written a whole bunch of cocktail books, and he wanted to do this filming where he would come in and he'll pose a question, and we would all try to say witty things and talk about the bar business.
I mean, he's also in his 70s. And,
yes, I was going to get to that.
Okay.
And so well dressed.
Very well dressed, yes. So we're sitting at the table and we're talking about all these questions, and Charles and the cameras are there, and Charles says, what do you think, what about all these women behind the bar? And it was clear that he did not think that that was cool, you know, that the women should not be behind the stick. And I'm sitting between David Wondrich and Dale DeGroff, and the two, it was like you could hear a pin drop, and everybody just sort of turned and looked at me. And I feel like I blacked out for a minute, and then I just, like, my mouth opened, and I was, like, ranting about all of the wonderful, amazing things that women are doing in our industry and how we do belong back there. And I think I politely told him to suck it or something, you know.
Fairly politely.
The funniest thing is Julie told me this story, and I was like, oh, yeah, he was in my bar yesterday. He was filming something with Jack, and when I walked in, his jaw sort of dropped when I got behind the bar to set it up. He's like, and she goes, want to hear a good story?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of left there that day a little bit angry, and, you know, I was like, where are we that, you know, we've come so far from being whores in the bar, you know, from not being allowed to go in, you know, I'm feeling great. There's all these amazing women opening bars all over the country, and Charles Schumann is pulling it back a notch, you know. So his producer, who was a woman, asked me, Charles would like to come to your bar and do a follow-up with you. And yeah, so, and you know, it was like
just to be more insulting.
Just yeah, he wanted to come to film at Clover Club, and I was like, you know, absolutely, tell Charles I'll meet him there at 2:00. So I was like, you know, this is great. Now I'm gonna bring it up again, because why not push it a little bit further and try to have an intelligent conversation with him and maybe change his mind, you know, maybe pull him into this century a little bit. So he shows up at the bar, and just like the sight of him, I'm like, and anybody anybody who knows me, I have no filter at all. I just say what I think. I'm very, you kind of know what I think generally by looking at my face. So we start doing this talk, and I said, Charles, I'd really like to talk about your opinion on women behind bars, and I just, I think that you really need to come into this century and, where we're at. And I talked to him about Speed Rack and Lynette and Ivy and all of these amazing women, and he, at the end of the discussion, basically what came out of it was that he just doesn't think that we should be there past 8 o'clock. So it's okay to do the day shift.
Yeah.
And then when he found out I had a 5-year-old, he was like, he was even more just, that poor child must be left alone. Anyway, so were we not able to find my file, Rocky? Where is Rocky?
Working on it.
All right. So when I first moved to New York, it was 97, and there was a woman who I kept hearing her name in the press. Her name was Amy Sacco. And prior to that, I really hadn't heard very much about many women owning bars. There were a lot of women running bars, but not necessarily who were owners. So I kind of put together this list. I went onto Facebook a couple weeks ago and asked, any female bar owners that I don't know about out there. I got 100 comments on this link, and it was amazing to me how many were out there that I didn't actually know of, and was really encouraged to see that there are women all over the country, all over the world, that really are doing amazing and great things and owning their own bars. But so starting with Amy Sacco, she was kind of the first one that I heard about in New York City. She opened Bungalow 8, and before that, Lot 61 in 1997. She was a Jersey girl, moved to New York City, and got a job at Boulay as a hostess, and was sort of meeting these, financial types and art gallery owners and celebrities, and decided that she was going to open a place, and kind of took it from the hostess side of things, where she became sort of like the lady who ran the place, and she managed the floor, and people went there, and she knew how to show them a good time. Her places were the place to be.
I mean, following in the footsteps of Nell Campbell also.
Yeah.
Nell Campbell,
Yeah.
a few years earlier, the same thing. She came out of like London High Society and decided to do the same.
Yeah, it was sort of, this beautiful, tall, blonde woman, kind of working the room and getting socialites to come in and that sort of thing. So Amy kind of was ruling the scene in New York for many, many years. And I remember seeing her name and being like, that's really awesome. And I never went to Bungalow 8 because I just was never, I was never the type to be like,
scary,
let
scary
me
place.
in.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Standing outside, very hard to get in. So after Flatiron Lounge opened, I talked to Audrey Saunders about opening her place. We teamed up to open the Pegu Club. I guess we're not going to find it. It's really just a photo of all these lovely ladies that I wanted to sort of show you guys, so that's okay.
Well, let's treat them like guys and say we don't need a photo.
So Audrey Saunders was at the Carlisle Hotel. She and I had been good friends for many years. Dale DeGroff kind of brought us together, and we talked about doing a place together, and that ultimately ended up being the Pegu Club. Now, Audrey was working at like the Waterfront Ale House in Brooklyn, and went to a class with Dale, and then told Dale, hey, can I please learn how to bartend under you? And he sort of took her under his wing and taught her, and she worked with him for many years. And then he started sending her out on these like celebrity bartender things in the late 90s, which was where she and I met, because he sent me out on one as well. And Pegu was sort of our brainchild that came out of that. Audrey's beverage program, but something that we really wanted to do. So we opened that in 2005. Here in New Orleans, T. Martin and Lally Brennan, who, if there are, Right, clap for them. They are, if there were
Amazing people.
ambassadors for the culinary scene of New Orleans,
Yep.
it's those two ladies. They're cousins, and together they are partners in Commander's Palace, Cafe Adelaide, and the Swizzle Stick Bar, and Sobu here, and multiple cookbooks that they've been a part of. They did a cocktail book together called In the Land of Cocktails, and they're like born and raised in this business. Their family own restaurants everywhere. So they're pretty amazing ladies. A new aptee from the Rob Roy in Seattle. She's another badass.
Yeah, she is.
She's the sole proprietor of Rob Roy, and it's so funny. She's got such a great sense of humor, and she sent me a bio that was pretty hilarious, and but it just led me to understand that Rob Roy, like, she's there all the time. It's her life, it's her bar, it is her. Without her, it's not Rob Roy. She works her butt off, and she's really done a lot for the community in Seattle with classes and kind of teaching and pushing everything forward and getting more people involved. I think the other thing that came out of this for me was seeing these women who own and operate bars really bringing in other women, and kind of by us opening places, we're growing as far as other women being able to do the same, because we then become their mentors, and it's not so unachievable to be a woman in the bar business. So Barbara Lynch is the next one. She is a James Beard award-winning chef who teamed up. She's opened many places in the Boston area. Barbara Lynch has Number 9 Park in Boston, as well as many other places. So Barbara Lynch, so she joins forces with John Gersten, who actually had been working at Number 9 Park, and decides that she's going to open a cocktail lounge focusing on the craft of the cocktail, with him sort of running the show, which won Best Bar in the World last year at Tales. She's so incredibly impressive. Reading up on her, amazing. All right, so next, Trina Sturm. She's also a Boston, Mass lady. Trina's Starlight Lounge, she opened with her husband. She's a mother of twins and still doing it. Awesome. You can do it all.
And if you
You just have to bust your ass always.
If you haven't been to this bar, you gotta run and go to this bar. It's an unbelievable place, and she's always there.
It was just featured on Diners, Drive-Ins, and
Oh yeah, cool. Gotta check that out. Yeah, she's very cool. All right, next. So Alba Huerta. Hey. I love Alba. Now, Alba is someone who I met. I judged her at Speed Rack really early on, and I think I was kind of hard on her, and then she just has taken the world by storm. She started, grew up in Houston, went to Vegas and learned a lot about hospitality, and then came back to Houston and started working with Bobby Hugel, became the general manager of Anvil, and then they went on to open the Pastry War and also Julep, that is about to open, that she is going to be a partner in those two bars. So it's cool to see people investing also, and it's like she went in there, she did an amazing job, and then they brought her into the partnership, and she just works her buns off. I love Alba. All right, next. So Jessica Sanders also, it's interesting. In my sort of looking up women bar owners, Texas and New York seem to have the most, which I thought was interesting. So Jessica has
the only thing we agree on, but
what's that?
It's the only thing we agree on.
This is true. So Jessica has Drink Well, also with her husband, and next. Jennifer Seidman from Acme Handlebar in Oakland. Seems like there are quite a few bars that are owned by women in Oakland, Berkeley area, Not quite so many in San Francisco, but San Francisco, it's like nearly impossible to get a liquor license. And being somebody who worked there, I don't know how you could ever make any money in San Francisco. I'd like to know how people make any money in San Francisco. Anyone? Yeah. All right. Moving right along. So I was going to focus solely on the U.S., but this woman is so impressive. Natasha Conti from the Black Pearl in Melbourne, Australia. She opened the Black Pearl in 2002 and has won a ridiculous amount of awards. 3 of her bartenders, all men, have won Best Bartender in Australia over the last few years.
Definitely one of the best bars in the world certainly one of the best I've ever been to.
Yeah, and I kept hearing so many great things
Casual,
about it. I've never been to Australia.
It's hospitable,
sadly.
it's casual, it's very smart. At the same time, they don't make a big deal out of it. They don't have all the look at our crazy mixology. They just make great drinks and treat you nicely.
Very refreshing.
I think that's pretty
I like
good.
It.
Yeah, exactly.
I like it. And then moving along, Karina. Yes. So I met Karina many years ago in Cognac when I went to the Cognac Council. And she was an up-and-coming bartender then. She was working at Candelaria, and she's gone on to open Glass and Le Mary Céleste. I'm sure that there's a better way more French accent to say that in. Yeah.
La Marie Celeste.
But yeah, so she's doing some pretty amazing things in France. And there were many others. I just wanted to focus on these ladies. And for me, it is really an amazing thing to see how much it's grown over the last 10 years. And some of the female bartenders that work for me and have worked for me over the years who are going on and doing just phenomenal things and starting consulting companies, and not just owning and opening bars, but doing really great things in the industry. And it's so refreshing just to be up here and looking out and seeing so many women. So thank you for coming, and thank you for inspiring me. And I think...
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
Let me pop up just to see if we have. I think we have like 2 or 3 minutes for questions. I'll also just thank you guys so much, and thank you guys for coming. I mean, this is a seminar that shouldn't have to happen. I mean, basically, the whole history of this is like up until a certain point, women were behind bars because why wouldn't they be? And then suddenly the world went crazy and it's like, oh, we can't have women behind bars. It's like, why not? I don't know. We've looked at some of the reasons. They make no sense. And now it's like back to why wouldn't they be behind bars? It's absolutely, hopefully becoming normal again. I know it's not quite normal yet. There's still boys clubs and little like kind of vest clubs with the mixologists with the arm garters, etc.
I went to EO the other night. I drank a glass of champagne.
And you didn't get to mix any drinks there?
I wouldn't let them.
But that's those days are past. That's
It's actually more helpful to be a female, and especially in New York City, I can tell you, no one wants to open a bar without a female on their staff, and that's actually, or at least 2 or 3 females, and I think that's pretty incredible in this day and age that we're
finally,
a big resource.
I mean, I'm looking forward to, I'm the parent of a 17-year-old daughter. I'm looking forward to the day where it's not really a big deal, if she does this or not, and she's not going to get any shit for it, which I think is where we're getting closer to, thank God, through the efforts of Julie, to a huge amount, Audrey, Pamela, a lot of people. But this is great. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.